Imagine it's the 14th of January 2001. You are a 43-year-old accountant living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your apartment is modest but comfortable on the third floor of a building in the Palermo neighborhood, with a small balcony where you drink your coffee each morning before work. You have spent 20 years building a life that makes sense. You have $80,000 saved in a bank account, not pesos, dollars, because you were smart, because you understood that the dollar was the safe choice. Your daughter is 16 and you are already thinking about her university fees. Your wife runs a small tailoring shop 2 streets away. You eat asados on Sunday evenings. You pay your taxes. You sleep well. You have noticed some things in recent months that bothered you slightly. The newspapers have been carrying warnings. A few economists whose names you do not know have been saying things that sound alarming. But the government has been saying everything is fine. The banks have been saying everything is fine. The peso has been pegged to the dollar since 1991. 1 peso equals $1. Has done for 10 years. Surely that stability means something. If you have ever wondered why currency systems that look perfectly stable one morning can be completely destroyed by the following afternoon, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It is repeated across dozens of countries, across more than a century of economic history, and it always ends the same way. The final warning signs were always there, and they were almost always ignored. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Back to Buenos Aires. Back to January 2001. By the end of that year, the Argentine government would do something that most people considered unthinkable. They would freeze every bank account in the country. No withdrawals, no transfers, no access to your own money. Your $80,000, saved across 2 decades of disciplined work, would become a number on a screen that you could look at but never touch. And then, a few months later, the government would forcibly convert all dollar deposits into pesos, at a rate that was not 1-to-1 anymore, at a rate that destroyed roughly 2/3 of the real value of everything you had saved. In less than 12 months, your $80,000 became the equivalent of roughly $27,000 in purchasing power. The rest simply vanished, not through theft, not through fraud, through policy. Through a currency breaking down in the exact pattern that history had already mapped out, step by step, before anyone was willing to look at the map. This video is about that map. It is about the final warning signs that appear before a currency breaks completely. Not the obvious signs, not the ones on the front page of the newspaper the day everything falls apart. The ones that arrive weeks, months, sometimes years before the end. The ones that people see and dismiss. The ones that, in hindsight, make historians shake their heads and say the pattern was completely visible. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Currency collapses are not surprises. They are conclusions. They are the last paragraph of a very long story that most people never bothered to read. Before we go further, there's something important to understand about how currencies actually break. Because most people think of it the wrong way. They imagine a currency collapse like a car crash, sudden, unexpected, a screeching halt. But that is not what the historical record shows. A currency collapse is more like a river changing course. The water does not suddenly decide to go a different way. Pressure builds slowly in the riverbed, sediment accumulates, the banks weaken on one side. For a long time, the surface of the water looks exactly the same. And then one day, the river is somewhere else entirely. And people stand on the old bank and say it happened overnight. But the geologist looking at the data says, no, this took decades. The core mechanism behind every currency collapse in history follows the same basic logic. A government spends more than it earns. To cover the difference, it borrows. When borrowing becomes expensive or impossible, it prints. When it prints, the value of each unit of money falls because more units are now chasing the same amount of real goods and services. When the value falls enough, people stop trusting the currency. When trust breaks, the currency breaks. That is the skeleton of every single case in this video. The flesh on those bones looks different each time. The names of the leaders change, the trigger events are different, but the skeleton is always the same. The crucial insight is this. The final warning sign is not the moment the currency breaks. The final warning sign is the moment the government loses the ability to tell the truth about its own financial position. Because that moment always comes before the collapse. Always. Sometimes by months, sometimes by years. The government knows the numbers are bad. The markets begin to suspect the numbers are bad. The government responds, not by fixing the numbers, but by managing the story around the numbers. And that gap between the real condition and the official story is the crack in the foundation. The river is already changing course. Most people just cannot see it from where they are standing. This brings us directly to the first case study, and it is one that most people in the Western world have largely forgotten, even though it is one of the most instructive currency collapses of the 20th century. We need to go to Weimar, Germany, not 1923, when the hyperinflation was already at its insane peak and wheelbarrows of banknotes were buying a loaf of bread. We need to go earlier, to 1921, because that is where the final warning signs were most visible and most ignored. Germany in 1921 was already in serious trouble. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had imposed war reparations on Germany totaling 132 billion gold marks. That was a staggering number. It was many times the total annual economic output of the country. Reparations means money that Germany was legally required to pay to the victorious Allied nations as punishment for World War I. The German government faced an impossible arithmetic. It could not earn enough through taxes and exports to cover both its normal government operations and the reparation payments. So it did what governments under financial stress almost always do. It printed money to cover the shortfall. In 1921, the German mark was already weakening. $1 bought roughly 60 marks by the middle of that year. But the official German government position was that stability was being maintained, that the situation was under control, that the reparations problem was a political problem that would be solved through negotiation. Here is where the final warning sign appeared, and it was visible to anyone willing to look. The Reichsbank, which was Germany's central bank, was publicly reporting its finances in a way that obscured the true scale of money printing. The banknotes in circulation were rising rapidly, but the official statements coming from the government focused on other metrics, other numbers. The framing was always about stability, about political progress, about the reparation negotiations. Between 1921 and 1922, the mark fell from roughly 60 to the dollar to over 400 to the dollar. Still not catastrophic. Still within a range that felt manageable to ordinary Germans who were seeing their savings shrink but had not yet felt the full devastation. By November 1923, $1 would buy 4 trillion marks. The final warning sign in Weimar Germany was the gap between what the Reichsbank's balance sheet actually showed and what official statements claimed. Anyone who read the technical financial data in 1921 and understood it could see the trajectory. The people who survived the Weimar hyperinflation with their wealth intact were largely the people who acted on that data in 1921 and 1922, not in 1923, when it was already over. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When a government starts changing how it reports its own economic data, when the measurements shift, when the definitions get quietly updated, when suddenly a new way of calculating inflation shows lower numbers than the old way would have shown, what does that tell you? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. The final warning signs are not just about money printing, they are about the specific sequence of behaviors that governments display when they know the currency is in danger but are not willing to admit it publicly. And that sequence has a recognizable shape. And it changes everything when you can see it. This leads us to the second part of the story. And for this, we move to a completely different part of the world. We go to Southeast Asia in 1997. Specifically, we go to Thailand. And then we watch the collapse spread like fire across the region. Because the Thai baht crisis of 1997 is one of the most important case studies in understanding what the final warning signs of a currency break actually look like in real time. Thailand in the mid-1990s looked like a miracle. The economy had been growing at roughly 8 to 9% per year for most of the decade. Bangkok was booming. Skyscrapers were going up. Foreign investment was pouring in. The Thai baht was pegged to the dollar at roughly 25 baht to $1. That peg, that fixed exchange rate, had been the foundation of confidence in the Thai economy. Businesses had borrowed heavily in dollars because dollar interest rates were lower. Thai banks had borrowed in dollars and lent in baht. It seemed perfectly rational given the peg, because if the baht stayed at 25 to the dollar forever, you could borrow in dollars and repay in baht with no currency risk. But beneath the surface, something was rotting. Thailand's current account deficit was running at about 8% of GDP in 1996. The foreign exchange reserves that the Thai central bank held were being quietly depleted. Here's the critical final warning sign that appeared in 1996 and early 1997. The Thai central bank was entering into secret forward contracts, basically hidden bets in the financial markets that were draining its real usable reserves. The official numbers showed reserves of around $38 billion. The real usable amount was closer to $7 billion. The official story and the real condition were profoundly different. Professionals in the currency markets began to suspect this. George Soros and other investors began building positions against the baht. On July the 2nd, 1997, the Thai government stopped defending the peg. The baht immediately fell by about 15 to 17% against the dollar. Within months, it had fallen by more than 50%. And then the panic spread. Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, the Philippines. All countries where the same basic pattern had played out, and the gap between official claims and real financial conditions had become too wide to maintain. The Indonesian rupiah went from about 2,400 to the dollar in June 1997 to 17,000 to the dollar by January 1998. Ordinary Indonesian families who had dollar debts saw those debts multiply by 7 times in 6 months. Savings evaporated, businesses collapsed. The International Monetary Fund had to intervene with bailout packages totaling over $100 billion across the affected countries. The human cost was catastrophic. Unemployment in Indonesia went from around 4% to over 20% in under 2 years. The final warning sign had been there: the hidden reserves, the secret forward contracts, the gap between the official story and the balance sheet reality. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the pattern we just saw in Southeast Asia appeared again in a completely different part of the world. This brings us to Lebanon and the Lebanese pound crisis that began building from around 2016 and exploded catastrophically in 2019 and beyond. For decades, it was known as the banking capital of the Arab world. Beirut had a reputation for financial sophistication and stability. The Lebanese pound had been pegged to the dollar at 1,500 pounds to $1 since 1997. For 22 years, that peg held. And Lebanese banks paid extraordinarily high interest rates, sometimes 8 to 12% on dollar deposits, to keep attracting foreign money. But the only way those banks could pay those rates was by depositing the money at the central bank, which paid the commercial banks even higher rates. The central bank was essentially paying banks more than it was earning. It was running what financial analysts call a Ponzi scheme. By 2019, Lebanon's public debt had reached 180% of GDP. The government was spending dramatically more than it was earning. The foreign exchange reserves were being depleted to maintain the dollar peg and to pay the extraordinary interest rates. Economists were sounding alarms publicly by 2018. The central bank used complex financial engineering to disguise the true state of the reserves. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand, keeping their money in institutions they have never looked at carefully. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section shows exactly what all of these cases share. In October 2019, Lebanon exploded. There were literal street protests across the country, triggered by a proposed tax on WhatsApp calls. The financial system began seizing up. Banks started imposing informal capital controls, meaning limits on how much money you could withdraw. Lebanese depositors watched in horror as their dollar accounts were effectively frozen. By 2021, the pound had lost over 90% of its value. The final warning sign, that gap between official claims and balance sheet reality, had been flashing since at least 2017. Look at Weimar Germany 1921, Thailand 1997, Lebanon 2019, and Argentina 2001 side by side. The skeleton is identical. In every case, there is first an unsustainable fiscal or monetary position that cannot be fixed through normal means. Then, the government begins using technical financial tools to disguise the true state of its reserves or its money supply. There is a period of official reassurance during which the gap between the real condition and the official story grows wider. Then, a moment when market confidence breaks and the rush for the exit becomes unstoppable. Ordinary people who trusted the official story suffer the most. Currency collapses are not surprises. They are the last paragraph of a story that was already written. The data across multiple collapses tells a consistent story. A massive and almost perfectly structured transfer of wealth from one class to another. In Argentina, middle-class savers lost between 50 and 70% of their real wealth. Pensioners were devastated. In Lebanon, the middle class was essentially hollowed out. Professionals found those savings inaccessible and were unable to pay for basic necessities. Contrast this with those who held real assets, actual physical property, farmland, or businesses with real productive capacity. Those who anticipated the crisis or who simply had the right kinds of assets by circumstance or design were not victims, but beneficiaries. So what did the survivors actually do? They shared characteristics visible only in retrospect, like early recognition of final warning signs. They were willing to take official assurances less seriously than objective data. They preferred assets with intrinsic value. The historical record consistently shows a preference for geographic and institutional diversification. Awareness of the final warning signs changes the timing of decisions. Timing in currency crises is almost everything. When you see a gap between official claims and objective data, that gap is the warning sign. History asks only one thing of us, that we are willing to read it honestly without the comfort of official reassurance. If someone you know is putting everything they have into a single system, share this with them. Subscribe for more. I will see you in the next one.